Welcome. I'm Dr. Alex, one of the organizers of the 2026 Central Texas Parkinson Symposium. This presentation is one of 9 talks in a series created to inform, support, and empower individuals and families living with Parkinson's disease. You can watch these sessions in any order. Follow what feels most helpful to you. Links to the other talks, along with additional resources and ways to connect, are available in the description below.
We're talking about limitations today, which is not most people's favorite topic, but I think it's an important topic because I'm not a big believer in toxic positivity. This idea we just have to make believe that everything's great and hunky-dory at all times because we know that's not true. And I think living with limitations is a very human experience. Probably nobody knows this person. This is a guy named Lakpa Sherpa, and he holds the world record for climbing Mount Everest the fastest. So Mount Everest is about 29,000 feet tall. Base camp is at 17,000 feet, and he climbed that in 10 hours. No oxygen, no assistance, straight up the south face of Mount Everest. An incredible achievement. This is Dr. Armitage. Hopefully you've met Dr. Armitage. She put together this presentation and this symposium. She climbed to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain in Africa, about 19,000 feet. Her and her family did this over the course of several days. Another tremendous accomplishment. And these are the stairs at my house. They're about 20 feet, and I was trying to navigate those, and I fell 2.5 weeks ago and fractured my right foot. So no one would ever accuse me, I think, of being an athlete. World's Strongest Man. I love watching The World's Strongest Man. Anyone watch The World's Strongest Man? So these are just athletes that have come from all across the world to, lift boulders, push cars, do these incredible feats of strength. This is the current World's Strongest Man. This is a 30-year-old gentleman from South Africa. He can deadlift from the floor 1,000 pounds. He can lift 700-pound logs above his head. It's incredible. This is me on the ground after my trainer told me to lift 90 pounds one too many times. Again, not an athlete. This is certainly not meant to make light of the very real challenges, the very real limitations that oftentimes patients with Parkinson's disease struggle with, but it's to get you used to the idea of we as humans have limitations. Unless you are the fastest man in the world, the strongest, we all live with limitations. So this is a very connecting experience, should not be an isolating experience. So we're going to talk about some of the limitations that patients tell us about as they transition across Parkinson's disease, and then some of the antidotes for some of those limitations. So when you think about early and mid and late stage Parkinson's disease, oftentimes the limitations that patients experience in that early stage is surrounding the diagnosis. So being told you are a person with Parkinson's disease. Show of hands, who has been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the room? Okay, good amount. Show of hands if you're caring for a person with Parkinson's disease. Okay, also very good. Any clinicians that are caring for Parkinson's disease? Wonderful, so a good mix. Diagnosis is a very, very critical step in taking care of someone, and it can go very, very wrong, or it can go very, very right. Oftentimes, patients with Parkinson's disease, when they finally get to that diagnosis, it's been a very delayed course. It's missed for many years, or maybe misdiagnosed, or that the primary care provider wasn't thinking about it. And so oftentimes patients just struggle to get the diagnosis. Some people, when they get that diagnosis, it's almost a relief. They're like, oh, at least thankfully now I know what's going on and I can start to take steps to improve. But for other people, it's heartbreaking and just world-shattering. I think this is a disease that has still a lot of stigma, has a lot of misperceptions, and so for some patients, when they hear that news, they can really, really take it hard. And then not only are they navigating reactions to their feelings, but they're navigating reactions to the world around them, to their employer, to their family, to their friends and church community. And I think that limitation oftentimes causes people to withdraw. It causes people to retreat, which unfortunately is the exact wrong strategy for most patients when you're told about this disease. So if the limitation is understanding, accepting, coming to terms with this diagnosis. How do we overcome that? So there's been literature and studies to show that the two main things that can predict psychological health in Parkinson's patients at diagnosis is self-compassion and optimism. And I think self-compassion and optimism sometimes are kind of woo-woo words. What is self-compassion? So self-compassion is an emotional regulation. It's very present-centered, not thinking about the future. It's very, very present-centered. And it is axis for three different components. So trying to move from self-judgment to self-kindness. Self-judgment, I think all of us are very familiar with. We get down on ourselves, we criticize ourselves, and we're too hard on ourselves. We're trying to move to self-kindness. So a strategy to move yourself to self-kindness is thinking to yourself, what would I tell my friend if they were struggling with this? For some reason, we're a lot kinder to our friends than we are to ourselves. Common humanity and isolation. This is another axis. Again, many people try to isolate because they feel like they can't be understood. And the limitation is so identifying to them. But if we can move from that to common humanity, again, we are all human beings. We all have struggles. They look different. But if we can agree that we are all in this together, it moves you better to self-compassion. And then last is mindfulness versus over-identification. I try not to say, Parkinson's patients. Sometimes it slips out. And moving that to persons living with Parkinson's disease. The idea of we are all people that have different diagnoses, but we shouldn't over-identify with that. And that moves you into more of a mindfulness. And self-compassion has been shown to have less anxiety and less incidences of depression in patients with Parkinson's disease. And then optimism is the contrast to that. Optimism is a very future-looking emotion. The idea of things can get better, things can improve. And we've seen, more so in other chronic diseases, but some studies in Parkinson's disease, that patients with higher levels of optimism are more likely to have higher quality of life and less incidences of mental illnesses. How do you put that into practice? Again, it's good to say I have compassion for myself, but what does that look like? One of my favorites is called a self-compassion break. You can do this at home, you can do this silently, you can do this out loud, but it's kind of got 3 steps, where the first is that mindfulness piece. This is a moment of suffering. You just say that to yourself. If you're having a tough time, this is a moment of suffering. Some people say this is stressful, or ouch, this hurts. But it's just the idea of you're bringing your conscious awareness to this. The next step is saying suffering is part of life. Suffering is part of humanity. We all go through this. Again, trying to get you out of the isolation piece, connecting you back to the realm of humanity. And then the last bit is saying, what can I do to show myself kindness in this moment? And so some people actually, even when they're in that they'll actually put their hands over their heart and just kind of hold that space and say, what can I do to show myself kindness in this moment? So if you do those 3 steps, it kind of shifts you out of that realm of blame, out of that realm of judgment, and more to showing yourself compassion. It's been shown to be helpful in both patients and in caregivers. Supportive touch is also a really, really great practice for self-compassion. Obviously, it's nice if your partner, your child, a close loved one provides supportive touch, which is literally just comforting gestures, but even people can do this by themselves. When you're touching in a supportive manner, it actually activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is you think of your sympathetic nervous system, that's kind of the fight or flight. Parasympathetic nervous system is calm, safe, comforting. So supportive touch is a great way to shift yourself into self-compassion. And then optimism is actually more of a behaviorally associated emotion, and you guys are doing a great job of that right now. So advocating, volunteering, becoming a part of groups, going to seminars like this. That's a great way to be around patients and caregivers that understand your experience, being able to learn what's the best practice, what's new and upcoming, and that can shift you into more of a place of optimism about the future, which I think is really an antidote for some of the hopelessness that can sometimes hit when you get that diagnosis. And when you move into the middle stage of Parkinson's, that's really more, you've shifted out of, we know we've got a diagnosis, maybe we've started to treat this, But now we're living with Parkinson's disease. When they ask patients what are the limitations of living with Parkinson's disease, some of the big themes that emerge are changing social interactions and maintaining that sense of self. Oftentimes patients, getting out of the house becomes more challenging. Symptoms of Parkinson's, of rigidity and freezing and tremor can make it more challenging to get out of the house and to do the things that they enjoy. And so some of those social interactions that people really, really enjoy become less common and less spontaneous. And then that sense of self, a lot of times patients can become self-conscious. Maybe they struggle to have their speech understood, or maybe they have trouble managing their saliva. And so sometimes they just don't want to leave the house. And then another limitation is that information, wanting to know, not wanting to know. This is really not settled in the literature. Obviously, there's a lot of patients that want to know everything. You all would probably fall into that camp, showing up at symposiums like this. And so oftentimes patients want to do their own research. They want to know about different treatments. But some patients don't. They say, knowing more almost makes me more fearful or almost makes me more depressed, just kind of knowing what could potentially happen, but hasn't happened yet. So kind of navigating that tension can be a limitation. And then finding a place in the healthcare system. I think, thankfully here, in this community, we do have some access to experts like Dr. Shawagpa and some of these movement disorder specialists. But oftentimes we hear from patients that live out in the middle of nowhere that says, the nearest movement specialist is a 4-hour drive. And so patients really struggle with that limitation of finding a doctor, a nurse, a physical therapist that understands their disease and knows what is best practice in treating that disease. And then I think hopefully this has been driven home many, many times. As people live with Parkinson's, one of the most effective ways to overcome that limitation is exercise. Again, I think hopefully it's been touched on multiple times, but exercise has been shown in so many different studies to delay the progression of symptoms, to improve both motor and non-motor symptoms, and it's accessible to almost everybody. This was created by the Parkinson's Association and the Sports Medicine Association, going over the 4 types of exercise that have been shown to be helpful. So trying to mix aerobic activity, strength training, stretching. I love the Stretch Lab folks that were over there. And then balance, mobility, and agility. So trying to incorporate all of those into your life is one of the best ways that you can overcome those limitations. Most of the people recommend doing it at least 2 or 3 days a week. But I tell folks 1 day a week is better than 0. So you always got to start somewhere. And it's not just when we think of exercise lifting heavy weights. This was a great study that was done. Exercise includes daily life. So this was a study they asked patients with Parkinson's just to every 2 hours write down what you did over the last 2 hours. And so you can see, oftentimes patients spend a lot of time resting or doing kind of more sedentary things like TV. But they also did things, housework, walking, bicycling, gardening. And what they found is that they were looking at the positive condition, which they described as motivation, optimism, energy, and then the negative condition, which was anxiety, sadness, pain, sleepiness. And so what they found is the people that did a moderate durations of exertion were much more likely to be in the positive condition category. And then they found a feedback loop that patients in the positive emotional category were more likely to continue to do exercise. So it's almost like if you can just get the ball rolling, it's much more likely to continue and for patients to feel better and start to overcome some of those limitations of Parkinson's. And in the later stages of the disease is often when patients and caregivers, I would say, really start to struggle more. As everyone knows, there's no cure for Parkinson's disease. There are medications that can help, but it is a progressive neurological condition that for most patients will progress to needing increasing help with activities of daily living. And this has limitations. I think oftentimes people talk about the changes in roles and relationships. Many times our caregivers note moving from spouse or moving from son into more of caregiver and how that navigating those changing roles affects their own mental well-being and affects their own health. Most patients also don't like feeling dependent. Patients, they don't want to feel like a burden. They don't want to feel like they're decreasing their partner's quality of life. And so I think that can increasingly become a limitation. and also cause anxiety, depression, and some of the mental challenges that we see in this disease. And I think this is when we really get to less of a medical model of health and I think more of a spiritual model of health. Has anyone read the book Man's Search for Meaning? Anybody? I recommend this book to almost everybody. This was a book that was written by Dr. Viktor Frankl, who is a Jewish psychiatrist in Nazi Germany. And he was sent to the concentration camps along with all of his family. And his parents were killed in the concentration camps. His pregnant wife died in the concentration camps. But Dr. Frankl survived. And so he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning, kind of talking about how do we as human beings overcome some of the worst, experiences imaginable. And there's a bunch of good quotes, but some of my favorite quotes from the book is he said, when we get to a point where we can't change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Oftentimes I feel like chronic illness like Parkinson's, we get to that point where we cannot change the trajectory of our disease, but we can change how we react to it. Another good quote that I like is he says that the last thing that anyone can take from man, the last great freedom, is the freedom to decide how we respond to challenge. The idea of being, we can't change the circumstance, but we can certainly change our attitude and our emotions around that circumstance. Because at some point, this is another quote from a mentor of mine, at some point, illness becomes less of a medical problem to be solved and more of a spiritual reality to be faced. And it's that idea of mortality, the idea of we as human beings are finite creatures. And as patients live and progress through Parkinson's disease, I think some of those spiritual realities become more front of focus. There is evidence, more so in other chronic diseases than Parkinson's itself, but there is evidence that increased and enhanced spirituality can decrease levels of anxiety, can decrease levels of depression. And spirituality is not exactly the same as religion. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but spirituality is just that idea of searching for meaning, purpose, connection to the universe or to a higher power or to the sacred. And so I always encourage patients when they're dealing with some of these late stage illnesses to start trying to find that spiritual center, start trying to access that as a form of resilience and as a form of treatment. Not really, I guess, overcoming limitation, but becoming more at peace with limitation. Oh, that didn't show up well, but this was another study that was done specifically looking at caregivers. I think oftentimes caregiving can be a very, you're the unsung heroes of chronic illness management, but it's a hard job, as you all well know. It's very challenging physically, it's very challenging emotionally. And there was a study that was done where they looked at spirituality in caregivers and found evidence of 4 themes. One was that suffering shared is suffering lessened. So the idea of if we are internalizing suffering and challenges ourselves, it's much harder to carry. So they encourage, of course, people to reach out to all the different people that are around you, all your clinical teams, neighbors, church groups. They also found that caregivers increasingly used prayer almost as soul help, is what they called it. The idea of even non-religious people talked about crying out for help, just saying, help me. God, please help me. Universe, please help me. Someone, please help me. This is a challenging situation. They talked about increasing your connections to your social circle. And then they talked about letting go when it's not yours to bear any longer. Sometimes one of my colleagues say, let go and let God, because at some point it becomes in his hands, not in ours. I hope this will play for y'all. There's a guided meditation that I wanted to take y'all through. So while we're working on that, this is a good example of when things don't go according to plan, which as Parkinson's disease, you're probably well familiar with. Sometimes things don't go according to plan. It's a guided meditation that kind of brings the caregivers through moments of when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling like you're at that kind of compassion fatigue, which is a very real thing, and kind of how do we work through that and still continue to provide really, really good care for the patients that are underneath us. E for effort, thank you for your help. Things to contemplate later. So I think when you're dealing with Parkinson's disease, thinking to yourself, what are the limitations in my life that are affecting my sense of well-being the most right now? So again, trying to not shy away from them, trying not to push them away, but trying to bring them to the forefront of your awareness. And then, what are the ways that I can reach out for help with this limitation? How might I navigate this? Or how might I come to more of a place of acceptance with this? And then I think the last thing, what might I learn from this situation? So thinking about those three things when you navigate limitations. And that's what I have for you. I'm open to questions.